Welcome to the Obvious Podcast, episode number 82. My name is Sonny Macon.
And I'm Peter Dyga, President and CEO at ABC Florida East Coast Chapter.
You are listening to the Obvious Podcast, or you're watching it, where all opinions expressed are our own unless we say otherwise.
Love the show? We ask you to subscribe on any major podcast platform or watch us in action on YouTube. Follow the Obvious Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, X, and Truth Social. All the links you need are in the show notes. And you can reach out to us anytime at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. And if you're enjoying the ride, help others find us by leaving a review wherever you listen. So happy Friday, Sonny.
Happy Friday. You know, as you kind of talk about if you're enjoying the ride, you know, we are, what is this, episode 82. We've obviously created a lot of content, and the feedback that we get is amazing. And we're very grateful to you for watching and listening.
For the most part, positive that we get feedback from. Actually, on the sources, there's some back and forth from, say, people who aren't so enamored with our content. You know,
that's just,
that's normal.
People with time on social media complaining about.
But it's kind of fun. Yeah. Because you see the back and forth.
Yeah. So as long as you watch, right?
You know, that's right.
There's no such publicity as
from
publicity.
the beginning. Hold on. That from the beginning has kind of been our objective, because if we don't have people watching, if we're not a podcast that produces regular content, we're not going to get that, and it doesn't allow us to at least get even a partial message, about sometimes the things we talk about, the value that ABC provides and why the association's important in this environment and politics and in government affairs and everything else in our industry. So in any event.
So I wanted to share with you and our audience a very nice email that we received from a young man who's a volunteer leader in the ABC ecosystem. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but...
And not our chapter.
Not our chapter.
But in the ecosystem, as Sonny put it.
So he sent us an email saying that he was on a long road trip and that he decided to listen to our show from the first episode to the 76th episode. Mr. Producer, by the way, he wants to put Mr. Producer on the screen. I said, no, absolutely not.
I see that we talk about him a lot and he wants to meet him. So
that's not going to happen.
Maybe. Another 100 episodes. Who knows?
Maybe.
Keep you, build the suspense, So.
Right. I mean, it was a very nice email, right? He said he listened to 76th episode, and I simply wanted to share how much I've enjoyed listening to all of them. Admittedly, I had wondered.
We have people binge listening.
Right. That's cool. Crazy. We're like the Netflix of podcasts.
Yeah, that's great.
By the way, I saw podcasts now on Netflix. Like, that's so strange to me.
Yeah.
But, they need more content. So this guy listened to how many hours of content? Over 25
hours of content.
Wow. I couldn't listen to myself.
20 minutes at a time?
Yeah. That's insane. But anyway, we wouldn't be here without you, our audience. So, we want to express our gratitude and thank you for watching and listening. But I want to read this line, which I really liked. This morning, I completed my task and listened to the 76th episode, and I wanted to share how much I've enjoyed listening to all of them. Admittedly, I had wondered what qualified you all to speak on some of the topics, but I must say I love how you all approach the topics from a layman's perspective, allowing those who may not be as versed the opportunity to understand the respective topics. And then he goes on. It's a lovely email. Thank you for reaching out to us. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. So he's kind of the inspiration of our topic.
Our topic.
The topic that...
Yeah. Because his line about, wondering what qualified us, I was like, you don't have to wonder. We want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Because it's a great question. It's a very good question. Mm-hmm. Right? Obviously, there's a lot of opinions that are shared. We make that clear. It's our opinions.
And we don't know what areas or topics, I forget exactly how we worded that, but so we're going to talk about them all. Right?
Yeah, let's talk about them all.
We could talk about...
I wanted to ask you.
Yep.
What qualifies you to be sitting in this chair next to me?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And again, what area are we talking about? So I think we're going to start, or I'm going to kick it off by just talking about from an association perspective.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
A lot about what we talk about here is association related. So for those that don't know, although I know I reference it often, I've worked for ABC in this chapter for what will be my 27th year this August. So I was a fairly young man. I came to work for ABC, and prior to that, I worked for, the legislature, and that's why, I think I was hired by ABC in this particular chapter, because we have had, for as long as I can remember and been part of it, a commitment, if you will, to having the very best, most influential government and political affairs program as possible. So, and quite frankly, it's one of very few chapters around the country. It's the only one in the state that has always had dedicated staff for at least those 27 years to government affairs. So, in any event, from an association perspective, I have 27 years of experience. Less than half of that now was as the Vice President of Government Affairs, and more than half of that period has been as the CEO. I had a great mentor for many of those years. Have attended, with him and around the country, many ABC meetings over the years, which kind of gave me, I think, a very special perspective on associations and association management. I was encouraged by my predecessor to pursue my accreditation as an CAE, or Certified Association Executive, through the American Society of Association Executives. So I did that and had obtained that. Went to the IOM program, which is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute of Organizational Management, which a number of people actually are doing that now with my encouragement. So in any event, I think just my experience, both in ABC, some of the professional development that I've done is kind of what I guess qualifies me, in my opinion,
and then
to talk on association.
You started your career in politics, so and obviously we are a powerhouse when it comes to politics on every level. So talk about that.
Okay.
Like, talk about your sort of genesis in politics.
So it's I think important to talk about that as well, because we're not sure exactly. We do speak a lot about association, and quite frankly think almost everything we talk about is tied some way to the management and the association and the value that we deliver.
But on our show, we talk a lot about
oftentimes talk about politics. So somebody might rightly ask, what qualifies you? So, well, I've been involved in politics pretty much before my adult life. When I was 16, I was chairman of the Young Republicans in my county, did campaigning for Ronald Reagan before I was old enough to vote. And then when I was old enough to vote, I actually ran presidential campaigns at the county level in my life. I've run numerous other campaigns. I've served in the Florida legislature, done campaigning for most of my life at all different levels of government. Mm-hmm. So pretty much I go back to, was very proud of being invited to Ronald Reagan's second inauguration, even though I wasn't even old enough to vote. But I was, again, a county chair for him in his second election.
Wow.
I've been a state past co-chairman of the Young Republicans in the state of Florida. Politics has kind of been in my blood and experiences since before I was, or 16 or even younger. So
you could obviously argue the fact that for 26 years you've seen the impact of good policy and bad policy at every level, right? From federal to local.
For sure. Actually, those that don't recall, for 100 years since Reconstruction, the Florida politics was dominated by Democrats. They held every branch of government, most of the cabinet positions, and it wasn't until the 90s, I was running campaigns back then and was running a campaign for a state House member in the Gainesville area, which is not a conservative bastion, if you will.
Thanks to the University of Florida.
In part, and just, from, again, the whole state was Democrat majority up until the 90s when Republicans first took over. And I was part of that effort, if you will. I was running campaigns for a guy who won a House seat, and he was the first Republican to hold that House seat since Reconstruction. And I'm proud to say, and the last Republican to do it was a black man named Josiah Walls, which, if you Google him, was a Florida senator, actually, from that area of the state. And that was the last Republican to hold that seat until the member that I worked for and campaigned with.
What was his name?
Who actually won. His name was Bob Casey. He was a MD, a general practice medical doctor, and a great man. Taught me a lot, about statesmanship, if you will, I think. He was just an incredibly humble man and a great guy. So
I just always remember the name Bob Casey because he was one of the... In the 90s, when I was growing up, he was one of the few, or the only, I think, pro-life Democrat.
The one from Pennsylvania.
And they wouldn't let him speak at the Democratic Convention because he was pro-life.
Yeah.
I remember that so well.
So anyway, I was, part of that happening in the 90s, and that's, towards the end of that period when I had enough working for the legislature when I came to work for ABC. So, in the late 90s, I had actually taken a leave of absence with the chapter's blessing. in my early years in the early 2000s through 2000, might have been as high as 8 or so, to actually continue to run campaigns for people running for state senate and state house. So, I had a strong enough reputation, and I tell people that, in my early years, like many things in life, you start by volunteering, and I worked my way slowly up to, being paid and compensated for what I knew and how I could run and organize campaigns. So in any event, I've seen a lot in state politics. As the vice president of government affairs at ABC, I tell people I spent a good portion of my life in Tallahassee, because when I worked for the legislature, I would obviously be there for all 60 days of the session and during committee weeks. And when I first became chapter vice president of government affairs, the chapter, as we do now even, sends up our government affairs person for session. So I did that for another 12 years at ABC. So I spent, almost 20 years spending 2 months a year in Tallahassee. So 24 months, I spent almost, 2 years straight without ever having lived there. So in any event, that's kind of what, I think qualifies me to speak a little bit about politics and running campaigns and state legislature and, the Congress and local government and whatnot. So for those that didn't know. So
there you go.
Now, Sonny, what about you?
Well, now I can't go second. I mean, that's such a impeccable pedigree. I'm not really even sure how to begin. So when I was young, I remember under George Bush, the father, the Iraq War broke out. And I had always been, even as a kid, like a voracious consumer of information. So I loved reading the paper. I loved understanding what was happening in the world. I obviously didn't have the context, but I was always kind of aware of what was happening, because I was, big time consumer of the news. And so when I was in high school, I was looking at colleges, and I really wanted to be in DC. I really wanted to be in sort of the house of power and get an inside look at, how the sausage is made. Because I'd always been interested in politics. I'd always been interested in global affairs. So I got into Georgetown. I went to the School of Foreign Service. My diploma says Bachelor's of Science in Foreign Service. And that's the oldest sort of international relations school there is. And I met a lot of interesting people from all over the world. And that really sort of expanded not just my network, but my understanding of the impact of good policy, bad policy. I had friends in Latin America and South America telling me how I had friends in Argentina telling me how socialism had ruined their country. I had a professor at Georgetown who was an expert on South American economics. And when I remember I was in college when the Brazil currency crisis happened. And he was gone for 2 weeks consulting with the Brazilian government. I had a professor who worked on Boris Yeltsin's campaign when he ran for president in Moscow. And so I had some really great.
You've had an amazing education.
I've had
your career in education.
I've had some,
and what it brings to the table in terms of expertise, but also some of your jobs.
Yeah.
And your experience, in terms of association management and the politics and whatnot. Also, I think
I was at Georgetown, and I got a job at the student financial aid office, right? Because somebody told me this is the best place to be if you want to make sure you maximize your own financial aid. So I come from a very sort of normal middle class background, and had a lot of scholarships and took out loans and all of that to get my degree. And I remember sitting in the financial aid office, which was in the second basement of this building, and they gave me a stack of files, and I'm like, I didn't come to DC for this, and I just left. I quit. I was on the job one day, and I went to the FBI headquarters, and this was obviously pre 9/11. And I was able to talk myself into an internship at the FBI. And it was an unbelievable experience, because that's when what was the name of the bomber who was mailing stuff in the mail? Unabomber, thank you. The Unabomber case was breaking, and I got a chance to work on that or help with that. And then I was like, now what? So I went and got an internship on Capitol Hill. So I worked for my congressman, who is now in jail for doing some pretty weird things. But that's a different story. But great experience, right? Because my congressman at that time was the deputy majority whip. Tom DeLay was the majority whip, so I got to be with leadership. I remember Bob Dole was running for president. Got to meet him a couple of times. I sat at this table in one of the cafeterias where I didn't see anything. I just sat there, but it was like my boss Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich were talking, and it was just like insane. Like, I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, and I'm sitting at this table with these people, and had incredible mentors, had incredible exposure to some really interesting things early in life.
How was your service because you served in some other nonprofit roles?
I did.
As a volunteer leader, though,
As a
right?
volunteer leader.
Both, actually, I think.
Yep. I ran a nonprofit. Well, I started at a nonprofit now it's like 11, 12 years ago, as a board member, and they were on the verge of bankruptcy. So I said, this is ridiculous. I'll take over temporarily so you can turn this, I'll turn this around and hand it over. I ended up working there for 7 years and took it from near bankruptcy to almost $1 million a year coming in. And so that really opened up my eyes to the whole sort of how leadership works, how volunteer leadership works, how you raise money, how you have an impact, and I learned so much about how the nonprofit world, good and bad, how it was structured, the impact it had. And just, the biggest thing I realized was there was no, and this is one of the reasons I love ABC. In the nonprofit world, there's really no imperative to be successful, because if you are successful, you will work yourself out of a job, right?
Sure.
And nobody wants to do that.
Because nonprofits are mission driven.
Exactly.
If you achieve the mission, you either got to reinvent yourself, which a lot of national ones have over the years.
March of Dimes, right? The polio gets solved. They're like, we don't want to go away. So they just reinvent their mission. And I always find that so troubling. Like the idea that you are not in it to actually
we have that day to look forward to when the merit shop and meritocracy is so accepted worldwide that they don't need us anymore.
They don't need us anymore.
So when that day comes, we will celebrate.
We will celebrate.
But until that day,
we will fight. We will fight. Yeah. So. But I love our mission, and so I've had just a variety of experience. One of the biggest things I think that changed my life, I think I was 9 or 10 years old, and my dad came home, and he's like, I'm taking you and your mom on vacation. And I'm like, where are we going? And he goes, I was
going to ask you about how does, sometimes our background.
Yeah. And he took took my mom and I to, I'm an only child. So when I say mom and I just mean like our whole family, to Thailand, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And I'm like 9, and I'm like blown away by, like, he took me to a tailor in Hong Kong. I got my first suit made at 9 years old.
Wow.
It was like just an insane experience. And that really was sort of what started, I think, my love affair for trying to understand how the world works.
And how saw in that trip alone a spectrum.
Oh, yeah. Real poverty in Thailand, the success that Singapore had. And I remember my dad, I was like, how? Because it was like the signs were, Singapore was just unbelievably clean and efficient, crime-free, right? And I asked my dad, and my dad said to me, I'll never forget this. He said, son, this is what happens when you get a benevolent dictator. The first time I'd heard that phrase, right?
Probably the best form of government.
Probably.
Problem is, how do you guarantee that they're benevolent? That's the problem.
That's the problem. You cannot guarantee that. But they have done, but again, it's a small island, not a lot of people. So
is that controversial, what I just said?
Probably. I'm sure we'll get some mail. Didn't one of our founding fathers said democracy is the worst form of government there is, but it's the best one we have, except for all the rest.
Yeah, or something like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe that was the sausage.
Maybe. Yeah, but it just
same.
But
point.
Anyway, that's just
life lessons, which we can't discount either. Right. They're important about who we are, and quite frankly, what does qualify us. In many ways. So I don't talk a lot about my background, but my mother was widowed with my father, 3 days old. Wow. And remarried at some point in her life, and that man, adopted my sister and I, and then she was widowed again in a tragic industrial accident with him. So she kind of gave up at that point. So for the most part, most of my life, I was raised by my mother, and she was a woman with, at that time, no high school education.
Wow.
When she was first widowed, and second time, I don't think she still didn't have a high school education. She went back to school. Eventually got her master's degree in public administration. And so she was an example my whole life. And I tell people a lot, the reason I think I am who I am today, listen, that's not really that controversial. It's because of our parents and our upbringing and our family. But more specifically, the fact that really government was of no help to her. She did it. She had to do it on her own.
Right.
And I think that instilled in me a sense of, and her politics were definitely right of center as a result, I think, and being a public administrator and I'll never, some of the lessons I learned in life, like in the conversations we'd have about government and efficiency and whatnot.
Yeah.
So in any event,
She
I think
saw
our
it
life
up
experiences are part, she did. I think our life experiences no less qualify us.
Yeah.
I think in some ways, and we all obviously have life experiences. So we're kind of running up against time. I want to say this one. Go ahead.
I do want to say this point about your story. There is, you and I have a tremendous amount of contempt for the victim mentality. And sort of the hard times and the trauma and the difficult times that you've been through personally, the fact that is so devoid from your personality and from your heart, I think it is such a incredible, admirable thing, right? Like I have contempt for this, not this new generation, but the millennials, because they just love being victims.
Yeah.
And it just blows my mind.
Well, unlike any of us, we probably, had thoughts, about,
of course.
Basically my whole life, it's been, I wouldn't be who I am today without every one of the experiences.
Yeah.
Good, bad, ugly, and every single one. I wouldn't be who I am. And who knows, where I'd be today if I didn't have all of those experiences. So, and that's true for all of us. So, we kind of started, and again, I want to just talk about in politics, sometimes people, let me back up a little bit. There is truth in this world. Mm-hmm. I think you and I share that philosophy, 100%. And there may be some that think everything is relative, but
I don't.
We certainly are believers. There are things that are true.
Yeah.
You could make a simple statement as 2 + 2 = 4. It's a true statement.
It's a fact.
It's a fact. Mm-hmm. And then obviously everything in the spectrum. So it's oftentimes the problem, I think, with politics is people equate politics to just opinion. Mm. And your opinion is just as good as mine when it comes to politics. But you know what? Even in politics, there are some truths.
Yep. Absolutely.
Even in political opinions, there are some truths.
Yep.
Our goal in everything, in every aspect of our life, should be pursuit of truth, not just opinion, and basing our opinion on truth.
Yep.
And so, that's, by the way, you've heard me say around here, it's the reason they call it political science.
Yeah, because there's a science.
Political opinion or because there is a science behind politics and getting people elected and whatnot, not just, who you like. That is opinion. And you might be for some policies and against others, but I think that's part of the confusion. I think the general consensus amongst most people is whenever you're having a conversation about politics, that what qualifies one person more than another,
or that all opinions are equally valid, right? Like that's just. I loved anthropology in college, and the cultural relativism of anthropology drove me nuts.
Right?
It just drove me absolutely nuts because that could be a whole show because there are cultures that allow or empower their people to lead better lives than other cultures. Like without a doubt, that is a fact.
Yep.
And the fact that I have to sit there and argue with an academic, no, they're not all equal.
Yeah.
It's not all relativism when it comes to cultures. That's insane to me. And I think the same thing applies to how we look at politics.
Amen. So anyway, we thank our listeners. We really enjoyed this particular email that we got, and we're humbled, that people are enjoying the show and that are coming to us at all sorts of different times, I guess, in our experience here in terms of taping the show.
Yeah.
Right? Because, he decided later on to catch up.
So
anyway,
So thank
we're
you.
Thankful. So I guess
I do want to show this. Mr. Producer asked me to show you his Tumblr.
Tumblr, or are you giving this away?
No. This is Mr. Producer's Tumblr, and Mr. Producer wanted me to say this is the closest you're going to get to meeting him is to see his Tumblr.
Now, stay tuned. So,
thank you for joining us. What are you gonna? Yeah, let's switch roles. You go.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for listening and honoring us with your time. As always, we look forward to sharing another episode with you next Friday.
For comments, send us an email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com.
Till then, ciao.
Take care.